Rachel grew up in a house where duty overshadowed childhood, and every small dream bent under unpaid labor. She scrubbed floors before school, counted coins after work, and watched her wages disappear into the family fund. No one asked what she wanted, and no one cared that she carried burdens meant for many on shoulders still forming. Madison laughed in sunlit rooms, while Rachel learned to survive in shadows, carved by expectation and silence. Affection came wrapped in conditions, and loyalty was measured by how much Rachel could surrender without complaint. Her world narrowed into routines, obligations, and the quiet ache of knowing help flowed in only one direction. By the time she stepped into adulthood, the pattern was set, and the weight she carried felt older than she was. Rachel entered adulthood with the quiet hope that distance would loosen the grip her family held on her life. She found a modest apartment, took extra shifts, and told herself she could finally breathe on her own. But the calls began before she unpacked the final box, each one wrapped in guilt and coated with familiar obligation. Her mother insisted that Madison needed new textbooks and said Rachel should help because family supports ambition. Rachel sent the money, even when it meant eating noodles for a week and pretending she preferred simplicity. Soon came requests for car repairs, sorority dues, and emergency fees that only Rachel seemed responsible for solving. Every month brought a new crisis, and every crisis pointed back to her as if she were the family vault. She tried to say no once, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any bill she had ever paid. Her father reminded her of all they had sacrificed, though the list blurred under memories of chores and withheld allowance. Rachel accepted the pressure because it felt woven into her bones, a script she had memorized long before adulthood. She kept track of her expenses on sticky notes that curled at the corners from kitchen steam and exhaustion. Most of them ended with minus signs, but she taped them to the wall to remind herself she was trying. Friends asked why she never joined weekend trips, and she lied about saving for something vague and unimportant. She hid the truth because speaking it aloud made the imbalance feel real and humiliating in a way she couldn't face. On her rare days off, she walked through thrift stores and imagined a life where she bought things without guilt. A pair of unworn shoes caught her eye once, but she put them back after calculating how much Madison owed. The debt was not written anywhere, yet it followed Rachel from room to room like a persistent shadow. When her sister called crying about a failed exam, Rachel spent her grocery budget on a tutoring session. She smiled through the hunger that followed, convincing herself that resilience was the same as love. But resentment grew quietly, settling in the spaces between her breaths, patient and sharp-edged. Each request reminded her that leaving home had changed nothing about her place in the family hierarchy. She stood outside a coffee shop one evening, reading another message asking for help with sorority travel fees. The wind was cold, but the familiar shame warmed her cheeks as she typed, "I'll transfer it tonight." She hated how automatic the words felt, as if her phone had learned the pattern before she admitted it. Her coworkers joked that she must be rich, always covering things without complaint, and she laughed along hollowly. In truth, she lived on the thinnest edge of stability, balancing bills like a fragile tower built on obligation. Rachel kept working harder, believing that more income would soften the demands that drained her every month. But the more she earned, the more her family expected, as if her effort existed only to fill their needs. She ended each day with aching feet and a quieter spirit, unsure when helping had become the only thing she was allowed to be. Rachel arrived at the Thanksgiving gathering with a cautious smile. Hopping this year might sting a little less. The house was enormous, glowing with warm lights that made her feel colder rather than welcomed. Relatives greeted her with polite distance, as if she were a visitor rather than blood tied to their lineage. She carried a homemade pie, because buying something nicer would have strained her already thin budget. Madison swept into the room in a designer dress, radiant and oblivious to the tension she always left behind. Their mother announced Madison's upcoming wedding with pride that shimmered like polished silver on the dining table. Rachel clapped along, though her hands felt heavy and her stomach coiled with a familiar ache. A cousin asked where Rachel worked now and smirked before she finished describing her modest office position. He joked loudly that her job sounded like an intermission between failures, and laughter spread like wildfire. Rachel forced a smile, pretending the words landed on someone stronger and less exhausted than she was. Madison revealed her wedding plans and handed out embossed invitations that gleamed under the chandelier light. When Rachel reached for hers, Madison pulled it back with a thin, amused smile that cut like wire. She said the guest list was tight and implied Rachel's presence wouldn't match the event's atmosphere. The table erupted in awkward whispers, while Rachel stared at the empty space where her invitation should be. Before she could react, their mother leaned in and reminded her about the expected $3,000 contribution. She spoke as though asking for salt, natural and thoughtless, as if the amount meant nothing to anyone but Rachel. A relative chimed in that weddings were expensive and responsible siblings always helped secure the family image. Rachel swallowed humiliation like a bitter pill, nodding because protest felt impossible in a room stacked against her. Carl, Madison's fiancé, stepped closer and placed a heavy hand on Rachel's shoulder with unsettling confidence. He spoke quietly about doing her part and squeezed just hard enough to make her breath hitch. The threat was subtle, buried under a smile meant for onlookers, but she felt the message in her bones. Dinner continued with forced cheer, but Rachel tasted nothing and heard every insult wrapped in false affection. Someone asked Madison why Rachel wasn't included in the bridal party, and Madison laughed as if it were obvious. She said Rachel lacked the right energy, a phrase delivered sweetly but sharpened for maximum humiliation. Rachel excused herself to the restroom, gripping the sink as the room tilted around her like a sinking ship. She stared at her reflection and saw a woman trained to endure, yet trembling under another public dismissal. Voices echoed from the hallway, mocking her absence, discussing her finances as if she were an open ledger. When she returned, Carl blocked her path with a glass of wine and a smile that twisted at the edges. He warned her not to cause difficulties and reminded her that her contribution deadline was approaching. Rachel nodded again, but something in her chest cracked, releasing a quiet fury she hadn't felt before. She sat through dessert with a rigid spine, listening to toasts that celebrated unity she had never been allowed. Every laugh felt like a door slamming shut, and every glance reminded her she was useful but never valued. The night ended with hugs she didn't want and gratitude she didn't owe, leaving frost on her spirit. As she walked to her car, the cold air hit her like truth, sharp and undeniable. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if she simply stopped agreeing to their demands. The question lingered, fragile but electrifying, as she drove home through quiet streets that felt strangely new. By the time she reached her apartment, the humiliation had hardened into something steadier. She sat alone on her couch and realized the evening had taken something from her, but left resolve in its place. The pattern of her life had cracked, and through the fracture she could see a road she had never considered. It whispered of boundaries, defiance, and the possibility of stepping out from the shadow cast by her own family. Rachel closed her eyes and felt the first spark of rebellion ignite softly, warming a part of her long frozen. Rachel stared at her bank statement and realized the wedding contribution would drain her account entirely. She hesitated, hands hovering over the transfer button, feeling a mix of fear and a strange, rising courage. For years she had said yes automatically, but tonight she felt the weight of every exploited dollar. She called her bank and froze the transfer, listening to the automated voice confirm the hold on her funds. Immediately, her phone buzzed with messages from Madison, demanding the money and hinting at social disgrace. Rachel ignored the first few, but the texts became sharper, each one stabbing at her self-worth. Next came emails from vendors, asking why the payment had not cleared, their tone polite but insistent. Rachel saved every message, labeling each as evidence, even as her pulse raced with anxiety. Social media erupted when Madison posted a public complaint, framing Rachel as selfish and ungrateful. The comments poured in, strangers judging her without context, compounding the humiliation she already carried. Her family called, scolding, lecturing, and laying blame on her as if she had violated a sacred law. Rachel felt her chest tighten with a mixture of fear, anger, and a clarity she hadn't experienced before. Then came Carl, appearing at her door unexpectedly, his presence heavy and threatening in the hallway. He leaned against the frame, voice low and controlling, hinting at consequences if she refused to comply. Rachel didn't panic. She recorded everything on her phone, the screen catching shadows of his intimidation. Her neighbors noticed the confrontation and called the police, worried for her safety, adding a layer of relief. Carl left shortly after, furious but powerless against witnesses and documentation he hadn't anticipated. Rachel reviewed her evidence and realized she had moved from helplessness into a defensive, active role. Emails, messages, screenshots, and recordings formed a map of the abuse she had endured silently. She started organizing files chronologically, building a narrative that told the truth more clearly than words alone. Each document became a piece of armor, giving her strength as the storm outside her apartment swirled. Calls from relatives demanding explanations continued, but Rachel now answered calmly, citing proof she could show. Madison tried to provoke her on social media, but Rachel refused to engage, letting the evidence speak instead. She blocked threats that were personal, archived the hateful comments, and created a secure folder for police. Even when Carl's friends tried to intimidate her through indirect messages, Rachel maintained her composure. For the first time, she felt the power of preparation outweigh the power of fear in the same room. She realized that resistance was not just possible, it was necessary for survival and reclaiming dignity. Rachel reached out to Aunt Linda, sharing the evidence, seeking guidance and allies she had long neglected. Linda responded immediately, offering support and insight into legal and financial steps to protect her. Together, they devised a plan to confront the family while documenting everything meticulously. Rachel began to feel an unfamiliar sense of agency, the knowledge that she could act without apology. The fear remained, but it no longer dominated. It became a signal to proceed carefully, not a reason to retreat. By the end of the week, Rachel had established boundaries, frozen funds, and prepared for the inevitable backlash. The first small victories, freezing the payment and collecting evidence, ignited a momentum that could not be ignored. She finally slept that night with a sense of control, her body relaxed for the first time in years. Rachel knew the battle ahead would be fierce, but the seed of defiance had taken root and would grow. The quiet thrill of standing up to her family filled her with clarity, purpose, and a determination that felt electric. Aunt Linda called Rachel late one evening with a tone that mixed urgency and quiet reassurance. She admitted she had seen the abuse for years and had felt powerless to intervene directly. Linda explained she had been collecting records discreetly, knowing a moment like this might come. She asked Rachel to gather any remaining personal documentation to strengthen the case against Carl and family pressure. Rachel pulled out old notebooks, emails, and saved texts, stacking evidence like building blocks of truth. Linda instructed her to label financial records, medical reports, and school warnings in separate folders for clarity. Together, they reviewed statements that showed money transferred over years, often without acknowledgement. Linda noted discrepancies in charitable donations Carl managed, spotting potential financial misconduct. Rachel photographed bills, invoices, and screenshots, each image reinforcing the story she had long kept private. Linda suggested compiling the materials into a presentation, one slide at a time, for a clear and undeniable narrative. They discuss the timeline of events, beginning with childhood labor, moving through adulthood demands, and culminating in threats. Rachel listed the moments of emotional and financial exploitation, connecting them with documentation wherever possible. Linda coached her on how to present without anger overtaking the facts, focusing on clarity and impact. They rehearsed slide order, ensuring childhood evidence appeared first to frame the pattern of abuse over time. Financial documents followed, illustrating the relentless flow of Rachel's earnings to family-controlled accounts. Medical and school records added credibility, showing institutional acknowledgement of neglect and emotional harm. Linda reminded Rachel to include photos and dates, making the narrative impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. She advised on capturing real-time reactions, recording interactions that might occur during the family meeting. Rachel added screenshots of social media posts, highlighting public shamming orchestrated by Madison and relatives. Linda emphasized legal preparation, ensuring Rachel had copies of every document stored securely off-site. They discussed potential outcomes, preparing Rachel mentally for anger, denial, and manipulation from family members. Linda reminded her that the goal was not revenge but truth, exposure of misconduct, and reclaiming autonomy. Rachel felt a growing confidence, realizing she was no longer alone in confronting her family's systemic exploitation. They reviewed Carl's financial activities, noting missing receipts, irregular transfers, and suspicious charitable claims. Linda suggested involving authorities discreetly, ensuring that the confrontation could lead to legal consequences. They prepared a plan to present evidence at the family gathering in a controlled, respectful, and undeniable manner. Rachel organized files chronologically, making it easy for viewers to see the trajectory of abuse and manipulation. Linda offered emotional support, reminding Rachel to breathe and pace herself when presenting the evidence. Rachel rehearsed her speech aloud, timing each slide, nodding when to pause for impact and when to let silence speak. They discussed the importance of keeping calm if Carl or others tried intimidation tactics during the presentation. Linda arranged for discreet witnesses, including legal and media contacts, to attend the family gathering as backup. Rachel compiled a small binder of the most critical evidence for quick reference, ensuring nothing would be overlooked. Linda reassured her that clarity, organization, and facts would make the narrative undeniable, even to skeptics. They finalized the presentation, with 18 slides capturing years of exploitation, threats, and financial manipulation. Rachel felt a mixture of fear and anticipation, knowing the confrontation would mark a turning point in her life. Linda reminded her that courage was in standing up even when alone, and Rachel felt that courage crystallize. Together, they prepared to confront Carl and her family with truth as their shield, fully documenting every detail. Rachel slept that night with a restless excitement, aware that the coming meeting could change her life forever. The preparation had transformed anxiety into strategy, fear into focus, and isolation into a sense of solidarity. By morning, Rachel knew she was no longer a passive participant in her family's exploitation. She was ready to act. The family gathering began with Carl speaking, his voice smooth and authoritative, praising loyalty and success. He painted a picture of unity and prosperity, omitting the cracks and manipulations that shaped Rachel's life. Rachel sat quietly, clutching her notes and controlling her breathing, feeling the tension in the room tighten. The first slide appeared, showing photos of her childhood, hands busy with chores while Madison played freely. Gasps echoed softly, as family members realized how much labor Rachel had contributed unnoticed for years. Next came financial statements, each transfer meticulously documented, revealing $47,000 redirected. The room fell silent as the pattern of exploitation unfolded, each number a quiet indictment of family expectation. Rachel spoke calmly, narrating each slide with clarity, her voice firm despite the weight of long-suppressed emotion. Medical records followed, displaying bruises, reports of emotional neglect, and evidence of repeated stress and anxiety. School letters warned of discrimination and exhaustion, showing how Rachel's struggles had been visible but ignored. Carl shifted in his seat, his smile faltering as the evidence stacked, slide by slide, against his public persona. A slide of the wedding invitation list appeared, Rachel's name marked with a red line, leaving her excluded visually. Social media screenshots flashed next, showing Madison's public shamming and the family's orchestrated gossip. Each revelation drew whispers, some sympathetic, some shocked, breaking the polished veneer of the gathering. Rachel's voice never wavered as she described the threats and intimidation Carl had delivered, recording proof in hand. The audience watched, many unable to speak, as evidence of ongoing financial and emotional abuse became undeniable. Linda nodded from the side, signaling support, ensuring Rachel knew she was not alone in confronting the family. Carl attempted interruption, his tone defensive and sharp, but Rachel held her ground, continuing the presentation. She revealed documentation of irregular charitable donations Carl had managed, exposing fraudulent financial activity. Authorities arrived quietly, alerted in advance by Linda, their presence reinforcing the seriousness of the evidence. Cameras captured Carl's escalating anger as he realized the control he had wielded was crumbling publicly. Rachel displayed correspondence showing repeated coercion, turning years of silent suffering into a coherent narrative. Family members murmured, some in shock, others in shame, as the full extent of manipulation became visible. Linda stepped forward, adding context to the evidence, confirming years of observation and documentation. Rachel concluded with a final slide, the message clear. Abuse, exploitation, and manipulation would no longer be tolerated. Carl's attempt to regain composure failed, and the authorities confronted him, detailing immediate legal consequences. Madison stood frozen, the reality of public exposure leaving her unable to defend her complicity in the manipulation. Rachel felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as the room absorbed the undeniable facts, unable to argue against proof. Questions from family were muted, and attempts to blame Rachel fell flat in the face of organized documentation. Linda guided Rachel through the aftermath, ensuring authorities received all records and supporting statements. Cameras continued recording as Carl was escorted, his arrogance replaced by shock and anger, leaving him powerless. The atmosphere shifted, a heavy tension lifting as truth replaced the long-standing illusions of control. Rachel's peers, friends, and a few supportive family members surrounded her, offering reassurance and quiet applause. She felt a strange calm, knowing the years of silence had culminated in undeniable validation and justice. By the end of the gathering, the family's structure was fractured, but Rachel stood intact, finally seen and heard. For the first time, she realized her voice could change outcomes, and standing firm could transform fear into empowerment. The evidence, preparation, and courage had converged, creating a moment that could never be erased or denied. News of Carl's arrest spread quickly, turning the family scandal into a public spectacle. Reporters arrived at the family estate, capturing images and interviews that documented the unraveling. Madison's engagement collapsed as friends and relatives distanced themselves from the chaos. Her wedding plans were canceled, vendors released from contracts, and the guest list dissolved overnight. Authorities froze family assets, preventing access to funds that had once controlled Rachel's life. Rachel watched the news coverage, seeing her story validated and Carl's manipulation exposed for all to see. Her mother called, voice trembling, admitting guilt and pleading for Rachel's forgiveness for years of negligence. Rachel listened calmly, acknowledging her mother's words without promising the financial support she had once given. Linda stayed close, offering quiet reassurance and helping Rachel navigate the sudden attention and pressure. The house Rachel had left behind was now a symbol of broken authority, no longer a place of control. Friends reached out, offering help, kind words, and a sense of community Rachel had rarely experienced. Rachel began organizing her own life, using the freeze on family assets to reclaim financial stability slowly. She applied for legal aid to secure restitution from the frozen accounts, ensuring her contributions were recognized. The local news covered court proceedings, emphasizing Carl's fraudulent activities and the abuse he perpetrated. Rachel followed the case closely, taking notes and attending hearings where her testimony clarified the full scope. Each day brought new revelations, legal filings, and confirmations of the meticulous planning Linda had initiated. The family's social network, once pristine and powerful, fractured under scrutiny and public exposure. Madison avoided Rachel, ashamed and humiliated, and finally admitted privately the pressure she had added. Rachel listened without anger, understanding that change could not be forced upon someone not ready to accept it. Her apartment became a sanctuary, the first space she truly controlled, where no one demanded unpaid labor. Rachel invested in therapy, processing the trauma, financial exploitation, and emotional manipulation she endured. She documented everything in personal journals, ensuring memories were framed by clarity, not lingering guilt. Linda guided Rachel through paperwork, financial planning, and public statements, ensuring every step was precise. Authorities praised Rachel for her thorough documentation, noting it significantly aided Carl's prosecution. The community recognized her courage, offering support and opportunities she had previously never dared to seek. Rachel reclaimed hobbies, social outings, and simple pleasures without concern for financial exploitation. She purchased a modest apartment, a space entirely hers, decorated with plants and items symbolizing survival. A jade plant became central, a symbol of resilience, growth, and life after years of constraint. Rachel began small celebrations, marking milestones free from guilt, without feeling obligated to please others. She felt the weight of years lift, replaced with control, autonomy, and a sense of deserved peace. Legal closure came when Carl was sentenced to 7 years in prison, a tangible result of their meticulous efforts. Rachel received a small portion of the frozen assets, enough to stabilize her life and begin independent living. She organized her schedule, work, and finances without interference, embracing the autonomy she had long been denied. Linda remained a steady presence, providing guidance, companionship, and validation for Rachel's choices. Family members who had pressured Rachel now faced accountability, and public scrutiny encouraged reflection. Rachel found herself able to trust her judgment, make decisions confidently, and set boundaries without hesitation. The media coverage subsided, leaving Rachel with a life defined by her choices, not obligations imposed by others. She understood that freedom meant more than escape. It meant consistent empowerment and self-determination. Rachel cultivated friendships and connections grounded in respect, support, and shared values rather than duty. Each day brought small victories, moments of joy, and the ability to prioritize her needs without guilt. By the end of the year, Rachel recognized her life as fully her own, unshackled from past manipulation and abuse. She embraced her identity, her work, and her home, knowing her resilience had carried her beyond survival. The trauma remained a part of her story, but it no longer dictated her future, leaving space for growth and peace. Rachel finally felt the quiet satisfaction of independence, a life lived by her rules, free from coercion and fear. Rachel stood in her new apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor, feeling a freedom she never knew. The jade plant she had nurtured now sat by the window, a quiet symbol of survival and resilience. She unpacked her belongings slowly, each item a choice, a reclaiming of life that had long been dictated by others. Carl's conviction and prison sentence felt surreal, a definitive closure to years of manipulation and fear. Rachel received a modest portion of the frozen assets, enough to stabilize her life and plan for the future. She no longer feared financial demands or emotional coercion from her family, boundaries firmly in place. Linda continued to guide and support her, a steadfast presence in the aftermath of upheaval. Rachel allowed herself to dream, planning moments of joy and independence without guilt or hesitation. Each morning, she woke with a sense of ownership over her life, a rhythm dictated solely by her choices. The past lingered as a lesson, but it no longer held power to define her present or future. Rachel felt pride in her courage, in standing up when it mattered, transforming fear into agency. For the first time, she understood that survival was not enough. Thriving required claiming her voice. She moved through her apartment with calm and intention, every decision a testament to autonomy. Rachel smiled at the jade plant, imagining the life ahead rooted in resilience, freedom, and self-trust. She whispered to herself, "No one regrets leaving a burning house, even if they once lit the fire." And with that, she stepped fully into a life of her own making, finally free, peaceful, and in control.